Today I thought I'd show you some of my watercolour sketchbooks that I made recently. I went to my local art shop and I bought some really big pieces of watercolour paper. I bought a Saunders Waterford piece of watercolour paper, which was 76 by 56 centimetres, and that one was 300 grams per metre squared, which is 140 pounds, so that's a nice thick one, and that cost me just £2.75 for that big sheet of paper. I also got another sheet of thinner paper, and that one was a Bockingford watercolour paper, same size again, 76 by 56 centimetres, but that one was a thinner, 190 grams per metre squared, and that's £90. And that one cost me £1.80. So what I did was I decided to split up the big pieces of paper, and I ended up making two small sketchbooks out of the thinner paper, and I ended up making one larger sketchbook out of the thicker paper. What I did was I actually separated each big sheet into smaller pieces by ripping the paper, and obviously I had to make some nice crisp folds first in order to get a nice sort of clean rip, so that I didn't end up ruining the paper, and then all that was left to do was decide how to make the small books. Now it's a good idea to actually have a sort of idea about what you want to do so that you can actually divide the big pieces of paper into the correct kind of size, because obviously making a book this size, which is kind of like an A7 size, what you're actually doing is you're making sheets of paper that are this size, which is more like an A5 size, because obviously you're going to want to fold each piece of paper in half in order to make your little signatures. So when you're making, get to focus there. There we go. So you can see when you're working with watercolour paper, you don't really want to make signatures of multiple pieces. You kind of want each piece of paper to be folded over, and that's it, that's your signature, just one piece. Now this works particularly well with a binding method like this. This is a traditional binding method. It was the first time I tried this particular method, so I don't think I did it tight enough. As you can see, there are some gaps, and when you open it up, those gaps are also visible. Not on this page because this is one of the folding pages, but for example if you go over here you can see there's a bit of a gap. I don't really mind, I think it adds to the charm of a sort of rough and ready handmade watercolour sketchbook. But this here is the lovely thick paper in this big one here. Oh, sounds like I've got a message. So this is a really crisp feeling thick paper. And so I wanted to make this one into a larger book, so that's the whole big sheet of paper in this one book here, and the ripped edges make a nice kind of design feature. So just want to open up the front here. What I actually did was I decided to use this binding method so that I could make the most of each sheet of paper, because the cover is completely separate, and also on the inside I used a cheaper, thinner watercolour paper. You may have seen me talk about this one recently. It's from Tiger. In one of my videos I was testing out this paper and some of their watercolour paints. I decided to use this one as the sort of, you call it the end paper. The end paper is what gets glued to the cover, and I didn't want to waste my good watercolour paper by gluing that to the cover and losing a side, so I used my thinner, cheaper paper there. And for the cover, all I did was I cut a piece of thick cardboard down to size, and this here is actually a gorgeous washi tape that I got recently in the sale in TK Maxx, and it's actually a really wide one. So it went around this book really nicely, and I really like the pattern. I think it looks really sweet. You can see the colour difference here. I put a couple of the cheap pieces of paper at the front there for if I want to swatch watercolours, and another couple at the back there, and then each of these signatures here is the nice watercolour paper. So that's that's that one. Now for the thinner watercolour paper, I actually split it into 3 sketchbooks. So you might have seen on my Instagram, there was also a picture of another smaller sketchbook, and that one was using the method that I used a few videos ago when I showed you how to make your own sketchbooks with a nice easy binding method that doesn't involve any sewing or glue. Now I would show you that one, but I've actually prepared that one for a travel kit because I'm going away, so I haven't actually got that one to hand, but the other 2 are ones that I used more traditional binding methods for. So this thinner piece of paper was able to be divided into a lot more sheets because obviously these are smaller sketchbooks. So this one here, I really wanted to use a nice offcut of leather that I've got, and I simply had some thinner sheets that I folded in half like so, and then what I've done is I've used some binding thread to thread the individual signatures into the book there. So that just makes a nice little sketchbook like so. The other sketchbook here I also bound with leather, but this one I used a technique whereby I actually glued the leather itself to the end papers. The end papers I used a pretty thick piece of paper, and then the rest of the signatures were bound together in a sort of, I'm not sure what the binding method is called, but basically you sew into about 4 or 5 holes there, and you keep going until every single signature is attached. Oh, this is actually the front of the book here, and I've already tested out one of the pages because I couldn't wait to see what the paper was like. So if we just take a quick look at the side here, hopefully if that focuses. So I can't actually show you the side of that one, but basically each signature is sewn onto the following one and the following one and the following one. So that keeps the whole book together nicely, nice and tight, and then I was able to wrap this piece of leather all the way around. This method doesn't usually work when you're covering something directly in leather, but because this particular leather, I think it's a lamb's leather, it's very thin and very soft, so it doesn't cause me any problems when I open it, because at the side there it can bend sufficiently. If I tried this with a thicker piece of leather, or if I tried covering the book with a piece of thick paper or card, this wouldn't work, because the minute that you open it up flat, this bit here would bend and crack and it just wouldn't work. But for this thin leather it worked nicely. So I'll just give you a close-up look of that page there that I tested some watercolours on. These watercolours are some new watercolours that I've got recently. They're the Prima Marketing watercolours in the tropical set, and I just did this little doodle just to test out this paper, and I really like it. I've noticed a huge difference actually between this watercolour paper and watercolour paper that you get in sketchbooks such as the Moleskine watercolour sketchbook. It just, when you buy a big sheet of paper, it kind of feels a little bit more luxury. It feels more on the handmade side rather than a sort of mass-produced side, even though this is probably mass-produced as well. But that's not to say that I don't love my Moleskine sketchbook. I do love that paper too. But there's something about these big sheets that you get from the art shop that they just have this feel of luxury about them, and they take the watercolours really, really well. So now that I've showed you my 3 sketchbooks here, I think I fancy having a go at painting in this one, because this paper is a lot thicker and I'd really like to see how that takes the watercolour. So without further ado, let's do some painting.